All right, and so now we are moving on. Last topic for this class, again, talking about death. Again, no, not the most fun topic in the world, but I do think it's important. We need to start first by defining what death is, which is maybe more tricky than you might realize. And this has become tricky really since the 1960s or so. Before the 1950s, the definition of death was pretty much set to the absence of heartbeat and respiration. So if someone no longer had a heartbeat, like you often see in medical shows or any show, when they think someone has passed away, they'll check for a pulse. If there's no pulse, then they'll declare them dead. That used to be the definition of death that was used. However, now we've had medical advances that you can have someone who doesn't have a heartbeat and isn't respirating, but then you can put them on life-supporting devices that can sort of recover those vital systems to keep a person alive. And so because of that, it's become a little more tricky how to define death. One of the first prominent cases that showed this was Terri Schiavo. Any of you familiar with that name? Okay, this was a case that happened in like early 2000s, so some of you may have just been recently born during that period, so it would make sense you don't really remember it. I have vague memories of it because I would have been pretty young then. But Terri Schiavo was this 26-year-old woman who suffered from cardiac arrest, and so she had lost her heartbeat and respiration, but doctors were able to resuscitate her and put her on, life support systems that brought her heartbeat and respiration back. However, she suffered some pretty substantial brain damage and was in what's called a vegetative state, which we'll talk about more, or I guess that is on this slide. So persistent vegetative state is where your brainstem remains active. Brainstem is kind of the most primitive part of the brain. It's really what keeps your heart beating and controls your respiration. So her brainstem was still active, but she had no activity in the cortex, which is really the area of the brain that you need to have any sort of conscious experience. And so she's in this state for a long period of time. She was married, and her husband suggested that they basically remove her from the life support. He said that they had had conversations about this kind of thing, and that she had stated that if she was ever in this kind of state, she would not want to stay there, and that she would want to, go ahead and pass away. And so her husband argued that she should be taken off of life support. Her parents, though, did not agree with that. Her parents wanted her to stay on life support, and so there was this really lengthy legal battle that involved how do we define death, and also who gets the right to make these decisions during these end of life periods. Eventually she did pass away, but there was this long period, I think between 2000 and 2005 or something like that, where the legal battles went back and forth. There were multiple times that her life support was removed and then put back, but eventually she did pass away. So that's just one case that kind of highlights how difficult it can be to really classify someone as dead or alive. The study of this is called thanatology. If you have trouble with that, whenever you're doing fill in the blank, just think of like Thanos from Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? He's like the whatever, killed off 50% of all living things. So maybe that'll help you remember that thanatology is study of death. So like I said, we used to use absence of heartbeat and respiration to define death. In the US now, legally, we use what's called brain death. So that's when you have irreversible cessation of all activity in the brain and the brain stem. However, some countries like China and Japan still use that more traditional definition of absence of heartbeat and respiration. There's kind of this growing shift, I think, towards the way that we view death in at least the US. It's probably a shift that's already happened in many other cultures. I think as we have made some medical advancements, things like life support systems, initially there was maybe a view that we should try to extend the quantity of life as much as possible, try to get as many years out of life. But now there's this kind of shift towards more quality of life where we want to live as long as we can, but if you reach a point where you're severely impaired and non-functional, then maybe it's time to sort of accept and move on. And so this is sometimes referred to as the concept of death with dignity. Death with dignity is kind of this broad concept, but it's also the name of a law that we'll talk about later. So just to kind of clarify, you may get those two confused. Right now I'm just talking about it as sort of this broad concept. But the idea is that dignity should be fostered through communication and care for the dying person. So providing assurance of support. If someone has a terminal illness, they know that they're going to be passing away at at some point, them assuring them that they will get support from their family, from healthcare providers, et cetera, throughout that period. Obviously providing compassionate care, which all these may sound obvious, but there definitely are some hospitals and doctors that treat, death and the end of life in a very kind of medical, clinical way, maybe not super compassionate. Providing esteem and respect, addressing any of the greatest concerns and trying to relieve those concerns for them. Candidness about death certainty, so it's shown to be helpful to be truthful, to let people know what their real prognosis is, to let them know that they are likely to pass away if they have some sort of terminal illness, rather than trying to hide that information from them. Giving them information to allow them to make reasonable end-of-life decisions. Part of that is being truthful about their prognosis, but also giving them information about whatever disease they have, hopefully in a way that they can understand without having a medical degree or something like that. And also giving them maximum personal control over the final phase of life. So trying to decide, what they want to have done with their body whenever they pass away, how they want to deal with issues like vegetative state, just giving them control over as much of that as possible.